And obviously, you also sit on the Homeland Security Committee. That agency has remained to be shut down. We're still awaiting some type of deal to potentially come out of the Senate and some type of resolution of this moving forward. What we are understanding is that the Senate could potentially have a deal that would include funding DHS, every agency except for certain portions of ICE, especially that remains with the deportation aspect of it. Do you think that's going to be acceptable for House Republicans if that is the case?
House Republicans will look at this, but I mean, at this point, Chuck Schumer has indicated earlier this week that he and the Senate Democrats would not be supportive of that. And look, this is exactly what he asked for just last week. They really asked for two main points. One is they asked for new leadership at the Department of Homeland Security. We see that Kristi Noem has been moved to another agency, that Markwayne Mullin is now the Secretary of DHS. He was sworn in this week after being confirmed over the weekend. And then they asked to separate ICE funding out for the other agencies that fall under the DHS umbrella. There are some 22 agencies that employ roughly 260,000 professional men and women who are first responders, who are law enforcement. The Senate has asked to separate those out. That offer was presented to them. And then Chuck Schumer has flatly rejected that offer. So at this point, the House has nothing to consider. We have passed on two occasions legislation to fully fund DHS. I've argued on the floor, and there'll be a motion later today, a resolution supporting the men and women of DHS, and we will have the opportunity to vote a third time to fund DHS. So until we see what the Senate is able to send to us, it's kind of hard to prejudge that. But I do think there's an appetite to end the shutdown, an appetite to end the delays that we see at the airport, and an appetite to pay our law enforcement and first responders for the job that they do.
And you obviously hear a lot from folks within DHS through your committee assignment. What kind of breaking point are we hitting here, not just with the airport lines and everything that we've seen, but also the fact that we are in a conflict right now with Iran, and there is an increased concern about potential terror attacks on the homeland?
You're right. We see the elevated threat level across the country with the conflict in the Middle East. We know that there's intelligence that we are receiving about potential threats here at home. That is incredibly troublesome, incredibly worrisome, particularly in a time in which many of those law enforcement officers who would prevent and respond to those types of threats are not being paid. You mentioned the lines at TSA, the travel delays at some airports that exceed some 4+ hours. And look, we're seeing some of these dedicated professionals walk off the job and quit because they cannot support their family. Almost 450 TSA agents have quit since this shutdown. And so this is going to have a long-term impact on retention and on hiring new agents for these agencies if we have this repeated cycle of not paying them for the work that we are requiring them to do. So it does have potential long-term impacts even after the shutdown is resolved. But it's time to end the shutdown, and it's time to pay our federal agents for the work that they're doing.
So are there any talks going on either amongst House Republicans and House Democrats, or is there any type of talks going on between the two chambers? Because we did see a couple Democrats go and discuss things with Katie Britt, the senator who's kind of leading the negotiations on the Republican side. Are there any of those similar talks going on amongst either between the two parties or between the two chambers going on?
Well, there are talks with the administration, with Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, because anything that is agreed upon has to get past the filibuster. So you're going to have 60 votes in the Senate. That is, of course, the first hurdle. Then at that point, the Senate would return to the House any legislation for us to consider. There are some preliminary discussions going on between the House and Senate. But again, the bulk of these negotiations are happening between the Senate and the administration for them to hopefully be able to reach a deal that can pass their chamber before being sent back to the House.
And should we be concerned that any deal that comes out of the Senate might have hiccups amongst House Republicans, or do you think House Republicans can be unified with whatever deal comes out just because of how long the shutdown's been going on?
Again, it depends upon the text of the legislation. If the text of the legislation is we want to separate ICE We're going to fully fund the other agencies, and that we know that ICE has money under the reconciliation bill that funds a large part of at least their agencies. It doesn't necessarily fund some of the civilian personnel that work under ICE. I think that would be something that would seriously be considered here. If instead we see legislation that is going to handcuff interior enforcement, things such as judicial warrants, things such as requiring ICE agents be unmasked, that's going to it's going to run into some headwinds here in the House, and I think it may have a difficult time at least getting a large number of Republican support behind it, and it may be something that would require a large amount of Democrats to fill that void, because judicial warrants and unmasking ICE agents are things that most House Republicans are very supportive in making sure that we're protecting those officers and that we're not gutting interior enforcement by requiring judicial warrants.
And if there's no ICE funding involved, do you think ICE needs to be funded in order for Republicans to say yes? Or do you think that is something that can be, pushed off to the side for a time being and negotiated still? Because it seems like that resolution hasn't gotten close yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's going to depend on the stance of the administration. If this is something that President Trump is supportive of, if this is something that he has his fingerprints on, and that if he is asking Congress to support this legislation, then I feel like that ultimately we will have the votes to get it across the finish line. Again, if this is something that the opposition, that the administration is opposed to, it's going to have a real difficulty in getting the votes that it needs to pass the House of Representatives. So a lot of that hinges upon, again, what is the final language that is worked out in the Senate, and what is the policy of the administration of President Trump? Is this something that he supports, or is this something that he opposes?
All right. House Ethics Committee Chairman Michael Guest and Homeland Security Committee member, we appreciate you. I'll leave you with a hotty toddy and a thank you.
Hotty toddy. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.